Good day. Yesterday, over the course of the last 24 hours, what might be a most important event in the Ukrainian conflict, one which perhaps signals further that we are now entering the end game, was reported in the media in the West, and I think specifically in Norway. And this was a series of comments by the Chief of Staff of Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, that Ukraine might want to consider ceding territory to Russia in return for NATO membership. Now, there is a report about this. In fact, there's been many reports about this, but I'm going to take this one from Unheard, and this is what Unheard has to say. And he said the title is NATO Official, Ukraine could cede territory to join alliance. And we go on to read, ceding territory to Russia in exchange for NATO membership could be a solution to ending the war, the Chief of Staff for NATO Secretary General has said. At a panel debate in Arendal, Norway on Tuesday, that's to say yesterday, Stian Jensen argued that it was important to discuss Ukraine's security arrangements after the war ended. In comments reported by Norway's most read newspaper, VG, Jensen reiterated the official NATO line that it ultimately lay with Ukraine to decide when and how it would negotiate. But his proposal for territorial secession is beyond anything that his boss, Jens Stoltenberg, has discussed publicly. Jensen insisted that his proposal was not final, but that it could be a possible solution. The NATO Chief of Staff stressed that Russia was struggling enormously militarily, and it seemed unrealistic that it can take new territories. The challenge, he noted, was how much territory Ukraine manages to take back. And this, in other words, in an attempt to try to sugarcoat the thing, we see that the comments are not made by Jens Stoltenberg himself, they're made by his Chief of Staff. We see that it's all wrapped up with words about how Russia is going to struggle to take more territory, about how the decision is ultimately Ukraine's. And of course, as I said, it's not Stoltenberg himself who's speaking, it is his Chief of Staff. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I think it is inconceivable that Stian Jensen would have made these comments without the approval of his boss, without Stoltenberg's approval. And Stoltenberg would not have given the green light to Jensen to make these comments if they were not being discussed with the officials of the Biden administration. In other words, if there wasn't more some talks upon these lines. And the proposal that is being made, which is that Ukraine cede territory, and note, we are not told which territory, that Ukraine cede territory in return for NATO membership. Cede membership to Russia, and after it's ceded those territories, it then moves forward and joins NATO. Well, that, in effect, is what we've been hearing for some weeks now, for some months now. There was some talk a couple of months ago, as I remember, that the conflict should be frozen, that Ukraine should go for the West German solution. West Germany claimed to be the country, its government claimed to be the government for the entirety of Germany, including the former East Germany. It was able to join NATO in the mid-1950s on that basis. But of course, at that time, there was a separate country, East Germany, outside the control of the West German government that was which was part of the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact and which the West German government treated as being under Soviet occupation. And that was the formula that was created. Then the idea was freeze the conflict. Well, of course, the German conflict was never an issue of direct military conflict between the Soviets and the West. But anyway, freeze the conflict, bring West Germany into NATO. And then, of course, eventually what happened, though I should stress that this is something that only happened with hindsight. It was not expected, at least not in the middle period of the Cold War. And in the 1960s, the West German government quietly dropped the plan, because at that time they came to think that the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc would continue pretty much forever or for always. But anyway, that's another story. But anyway, the idea was that what eventually happened is that the Soviet Union collapsed, the Eastern Bloc collapsed, and indeed West Germany was then able to absorb East Germany. The two Germanys reunited, and they both remained part of NATO, and of course of what became the European Union, and remained firmly anchored within the Euro-Atlantic community. So that was the plan. It's been discussed previously in the Western media, in the American media specifically, that you freeze the conflict, cede territories to Russia, don't formally recognize those territories as part of Russia, bring the rest of Ukraine into NATO, bide your time, build up this pro-Western NATO Ukraine, and then eventually wait for the government in Moscow to collapse, for Russia to change its position. And then that's the aspiration anyway. Wait for the day when all those eastern territories, including presumably Crimea, are reabsorbed by Ukraine. That seems to be the plan. And if we go back to that article in Moscow Times, which I discussed a few weeks ago. Now, we'll come to that article in a moment, but we can see that this is also, in effect, the proposal that is now being floated by these ex-diplomats, the people from the Council of Foreign Relations, to the government in Moscow in these Tier 1.5 talks, as they like to call them. And if you go back to my discussion of that Moscow Times article, there was various talks there about ceding territory to Russia, that this is now acknowledged, that this is inevitable, that this is unavoidable, that there is no conceivable way that the Russians are going to be persuaded at any proximate time to disgorge these territories. But the most interesting thing about the comments made by that participant in these talks to Moscow Times is that there was no mention of NATO in any of his words. There was no discussion of Ukraine's prospective or possible NATO membership in any part of that article. And I pointed that out at the time, that this is the elephant in the room, if you like, which these American officials aren't prepared to talk about. And it's also, to my mind, reasonably consistent with some of the ideas that the State Department has been floating. One gets the sense that, as is always the way in the United States and with the West, Eve Smith at Naked Capitalism discussed this in a brilliant article that she published, that Naked Capitalism published some months ago. The West, when it finds itself in these kind of situations, tries to find a way through. That involves a complex and very difficult negotiation between the various factions in Washington, between the United States and its European allies. Some kind of a compromise is then reached between them after this very difficult negotiation. They then take the proposal with them to the other side, and then when the other side rejects it, they're left baffled and bewildered. But of course, they find it impossible to renegotiate those terms that they've agreed with each other. In other words, all the energy is spent on negotiating within the West and within the United States, within the US government. And the question of negotiating with the Russians is actually an afterthought. The possibility that the Russians might say no and mean no is a possibility that nobody really in the West considers. And I've seen this happen time and time again. I remember being confronted with the details of this over the course of some incredibly complex negotiations that took place between the United States and the Russians in 2015 and 2016 over the conflict in Syria. The United States made all kinds of proposals to the Russians in return for the anticipated Russian agreement that President Assad of Syria ought to step down from the presidency of Syria as part of a settlement of the Syrian conflict. The United States made all kinds of proposals, and they were always baffled whenever the Russians came back and said, look, this isn't what we're prepared to talk about. There is no conceivable way in which we're going to ask President Assad to step down. That's not what we are here, what we're about. That's not what we're going to do. And again, the United States had spent an enormous amount of energy talking about the proposals that it was going to come up with to the Russians, offers, for example, to include Russia in the anti-ISIS coalition, make all kinds of proposals to guarantee Russian bases in Syria, lots of things like that. And one could see that this had all been discussed at enormous length within the Washington bureaucracy and with the US's European allies. And again, there was astonishment and incredulity when all of these proposals fell flat when they were presented to Moscow. I can remember meetings between Secretary Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. I remember Secretary Kerry coming to Moscow and meeting with Putin. The Russians were so angry with one of those meetings that, most unusually, as I remember, the Kremlin even failed to provide a readout. But anyway, there it was. So all of those negotiations were for nothing because the US and the Europeans, the West, had spent all their time negotiating with each other, making what they thought were concessions which the Russians would accept, and not recognizing that, in fact, as far as the Russians were concerned, they were missing the main point, which is that in Syria, the Russians were opposed on principle to any kind of regime change in that country, which engineering President Assad's removal would have amounted to, just as they failed to understand that in terms of the Ukraine conflict, NATO membership is for the Russians an absolutely non-negotiable issue. they will never agree to it, and they will never agree to any terms which purport to resolve this conflict, which leave that issue unresolved. So this is where we are. Now, one can see that the Western powers are not only busy or trying to negotiate this with each other, but they're, of course, having lots of problems trying to get the Ukrainians to agree to it also. And we had comments from President Zelensky, from Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, adamantly refusing to even consider the question of ceding territory to Russia. There's been a furious statement from Mikhailo Podolyak, one of Zelensky's spokesmen, saying that this isn't something that Ukraine is even prepared to discuss, let alone negotiate about. So just as the Western powers busy negotiating with each other, the United States busy negotiating with itself, the various factions in the administration and in Washington talking about all of this together with each other, just as they're not taking Russian positions into account, they're not taking Ukrainian positions into account either. They find it very difficult to understand that what they negotiate with each other is something that others might not be interested in. In terms of the Russians, one of the fundamental mistakes that the West consistently makes and has made since well before the Cold War ended is that they assume a completely cynical approach on the part of the Russians and on their part of their foreign policy. So when the Russians, for example, said at the time of the Syrian conflict that regime change in Syria was absolutely not something that Russia would entertain, for them that was a non-negotiable issue. They were not interested in purported concessions about bases and anti-ISIS coalitions or anything of that kind, because that didn't address, as far as the Russians were concerned, the main issue, which is that regime change was something that had to be put off the table. The West found that impossible to understand. They assumed that the Russians could be bought off or bullied by all of these other offers and by the threats, by the way, which went along with it. So I think the West today has worked itself up into the belief that all that the Russians are interested in Ukraine is some kind of a land grab, and that as far as the Russians are concerned, an absolute refusal, an absolute issue, NATO, the issue of NATO, on the contrary, is for them the central issue. And going back to that article in Moscow Times, I also pointed out that the article conceded that the talks with the Russians had hit an impasse. It was obvious that the person who was briefing Moscow Times about the discussions was signalling deep frustration with the fact that the negotiations were going nowhere. And I also said that the whole point about leaking all of the information about the negotiations to Moscow Times was both to signal to the Russians that the West was really in earnest, and also to signal to the supposed dissidents within the Russian establishment, these mythological people who supposedly exist in the Kremlin, the power brokers there, the people who supposedly control the Kremlin and who control President Putin's fate, to signal to them that a deal is there and that it's Putin who's causing all the trouble, and all they have to do is to remove Putin, and a deal giving all these territories to the Russians can be done. The West not only has a cynical view of Russian intentions in terms of Russian foreign policy, but also a completely cynical view of Russian domestic policies, and, by the way, an entirely incorrect view of Russian domestic policy, which nothing can change, no facts ever change. They persist in believing, they've consistently believed ever since President Putin rose to become president of Russia, that in fact he owes his position not to the fact that he was elected to the presidency by the Russian people, not the fact that he is anchored in the Russian constitution and in the institutional systems that exist in Russia, but that he is purely a product of Kremlin oligarchs, of the so-called kleptocracy, and that they can remove him from power whenever they choose. A view, an understanding of Russian policy, which is as wrong as the perspective the West has about Russian foreign policy. But anyway, as I said, there's nothing apparently that can ever induce the West to change their views about it. Now, before I proceed, I would say that I constantly get people coming back to me. They say that the Moscow Times article is wrong, that Maria Zakharova, on behalf of the Foreign Ministry, has denied that these talks are taking place. And in fact, I've reported on these denials in the past. She specifically denied that there are Tier 2 or Tier 1.5 talks taking place, and that the result is that the Moscow Times article is just empty rumour and speculation and basically nonsense. And I have myself, in the past, wondered whether it might be an exercise in disinformation, whether in fact there are indeed discussions of this kind taking place at all. And as I've said previously, I take full notice of Zakharova's denials, and I think in a sense they are true, because what is happening, if you read the Moscow Times article, if you look at these latest comments by Stian Jensen, what you can see is that various people representing the United States, or purporting to represent the United States, but none of them have any official positions, are coming along to the Russians, meeting with Russian officials. We're not told which officials, by the way, coming up with suggestions. The Russians will only treat them as suggestions for ending the war, which, as far as the Russians are concerned, are hopeless and meaningless, and which the Russians are turning down flat. It is not Tier 1.5 talks. It's not negotiations. The expression Tier 1.5 talks is one that I think the Americans have come up with. It's just that the Russians are receiving people who are telling them things that the Russians are simply not interested in. And that's why that Moscow Times article appeared, because with their cynical view of Russian domestic politics, with their cynical view about Russian foreign policy, the people who are engaged in these talks find it deeply frustrating and indeed incomprehensible that they're not being able to make any progress at all. Anyway, that's where we are. It's now starting to become public, and this is the first open statement by a Western official, somebody in an actual West who actually enjoys an official Western capacity, a position in a Western structure, Stian Jensen, actually floating what I think is the compromise that the West is trying to sell to the Russians. Keep Crimea, keep Donbass, keep your land bridge, but let the rest of Ukraine, leave the rest of Ukraine alone, so that one day, perhaps, we can integrate it into NATO. Probably they're not putting it as straightforwardly as that to the Russians, but I suspect whenever the Russians bring up the topic of NATO and of Ukraine's prospective NATO membership, the response, standard response, the one that has been followed by NATO for years now, is that this isn't a topic that they're prepared to discuss, because there is this principle, non-existent principle, by the way. It is nowhere to be found in the Washington Treaty. But anyway, this principle that NATO membership is open, and that this isn't something that the Western powers, Western governments are able to talk about. So, there we are. That, if you like, is Plan B. And the reason the West is now confronted with Plan B is because the counteroffensive, it's now becoming increasingly clear, has failed. Now, we've had a lot more reports about the situation over the last 24 hours on the battlegrounds, and it's all stacking up increasingly to point an increasingly bleak picture for Ukraine. Now, the first thing to say is that there's been a lot more reports about further Russian advances in the north, in the Kupiansk, Svatovo, Kremenaya, Liman area. And again, it's very difficult to get an overall sense of what the fighting involves, but I've seen some maps. There are different maps from different people. They show the frontline positions in different places. All of them, however, make it fairly clear that Kupiansk is now becoming very vulnerable indeed to a Russian attack. I don't know when that attack is going to come. It's not for me to guess. I don't know how strong Ukrainian defenses in this area will be. I don't know what the Russian plans are, whether they intend to try to encircle Kupiansk and the garrison there, which is said, by the way, to number 20,000, or whether instead they are proposing to launch an all-out assault on Kupiansk. But anyway, one way or the other, you look at any of the maps, it is becoming increasingly clear now that Kupiansk is becoming increasingly vulnerable, and given the strength of Russian forces in the area and the disorganized state of Ukraine's defenses in the area, it is starting increasingly to look as if Ukraine, is quietly having to acknowledge that Kupiansk itself is probably undefendable. So that is an alarming development for Ukraine. It is an alarming development for Ukraine's Western sponsors. But I suspect that it is not the single most serious and concerning issue for the Western powers, because I'm not sure to what extent they have actually absorbed the events on the northern front lines in their various discussions. I think that they have been so focused on the offensive for so long that at the moment, still, most of the effort, most of the thinking is concentrated of what is happening on the southern front lines where Ukraine continues to conduct its offensive. And here, as I said, the news is bleak. Firstly, despite strenuous Ukrainian attacks to capture Urozhainoye in the Vremivka salient area, it's clear that Ukraine has so far failed to consolidate control of this village any more than it's been able to consolidate control of the neighboring village of Staromayorsk. This has been another battle for a single village, which is taking weeks to resolve in an area some distance away from the major Russian fortified lines. Ukraine has thrown everything it can in the area to try to capture this one village, and it's finding it extremely tough going, achieving even that. So, situation there is not good. Further to the north, in the Bakhmut area, the other place where Ukraine was going to try and push the Russians back, I suspect to some extent, by the way, against Western advice. I've discussed how Bakhmut, fighting around Bakhmut, has become increasingly General Syrskyi's private war. He and President Zelensky seem to have a fixation about Bakhmut. They defended Bakhmut at appalling cost throughout the autumn and winter and spring, allowing the Ukrainian army to be bled white, trying to defend this ultimately undefendable town. And they then decided between them, once the Russians had captured the town, indeed even before the Russians had captured the town, not to accept that fact, not to pull back perhaps to fortified lines closer to Kramatorsk, one of the two big towns in this area which Ukraine has to defend, the other one being Slavyansk, further to the north. Anyway, not to pull back to those places in order to try to hope to cling on to at least part of the Donbass, but instead they decided to launch offensives to recapture Bakhmut, or at least a part of Bakhmut, to maintain the fiction that Fortress Bakhmut, as it had been called, as it was called by the Ukrainian government and by Ukraine's extremely powerful public relations machine, had not fallen, and that Ukraine ultimately would regain control of this essentially destroyed town. Anyway, I suspect that, in fact, I don't suspect that there were actual reports in the Western media, made it pretty clear that the United States in particular was deeply skeptical about this fixation that Syrskyi and Zelensky have with Bakhmut. I remember that on Larry Johnson's blog, Sonar 21, Larry republished comments by a high-placed source within the US government, whom he has contact with. Anyway, this source actually said that Zelensky's and Syrskyi's plan, this is before Bakhmut had fallen, so Zelensky's and Syrskyi's plan to launch a counterattack in the Bakhmut area was something that had not been agreed to by the United States, that the United States was entirely skeptical about this, that they saw this as a diversion of resources away from the front that really mattered, which is the front in the south, the area of Zaporozhye, where the great plan was to break through and to cut Russia's land bridge. Anyway, this private war that Zelensky and especially Syrskyi have been fighting in the Bakhmut area, it has achieved, as I discussed in my program yesterday, nothing the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians back on the flanks in the north around Berkovka, the village of Berkovka, which, contrary to some claims, the Ukrainians have never recaptured. And in the area of the Berkovka reservoir, the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians back there. The Russians also appear to have pushed the Ukrainians back in the area to the southwest, near this village of Klesheyevka, which the Ukrainians have also been trying to capture at appalling cost for weeks now. That the offensive, in other words, to break the flanks around Bakhmut, to encircle the town, to retake at least part of it, to prolong the battle for Bakhmut, all of that, for the moment, appears to be achieving nothing. And the other place that the Ukrainians were attacking from, Orekhov, towards ultimately Tokmak, and then on towards Melitopol, and then ultimately from Melitopol to the Sea of Azov, breaking the Russian land bridge. Well, so far, Ukraine continues to be bogged down, launching attack after attack, trying to take the single village of Rabotino, well to the north, some distance to the north of the big Russian fortified lines, the Surovikin line. And so far, despite enormous expenditure in men and machines, they failed to capture Rabotino. And many of the most embarrassing pictures, the pictures of burnt-out Leopard 2 tanks and burnt-out Bradleys, come from this area of the fighting. It is around here that the attacks, the Ukrainian attacks, where this Western equipment has been seen burning on the steppes as they are picked off by Russian artillery. It is in this area where those pictures now appear. And there's been a whole cluster of reports about this. There's more reports. I just read one in Redovka, which claims that there's been more cases of burnt-out Leopard 2s and Bradleys in this area again, and that these tanks, this Western equipment has once again been thrown into the attack towards Rabotino. They say that the attack, this is Redovka. I haven't seen much discussion of this in other Russian channels, but that this attack has failed, this latest attack has failed, and more items of Western equipment have been lost. And apparently there's another report by a journalist from CNN who's visited the area north of Rabotino. I haven't seen this report, but apparently this journalist is saying that it is all but impossible for Ukraine to break through in this area. Russian fortifications are too strong. Russian artillery positions are too strong. The minefields are too dense, and that all of these attacks are failing. There's a further report, and it is by David Axe, apparently of Forbes. Again, I haven't seen this report, but I've seen various commentaries about this, that Ukraine has now deployed its last reserves, the ones with the Striker wheeled armoured vehicles and the Challenger 2 tanks, the British Challenger 2 tanks, to this particular part of the battlefield. This is the last reserve to be thrown into this battle. It's the last chance for any kind of attack, the last attempt to capture Rabotino itself. And of course, if Rabotino is captured, perhaps one day it will be. I mean, it's not impossible. The Ukrainians are trying incredibly hard to capture this one village. But if Rabotino is indeed captured, I don't personally see how that changes the overall picture, because beyond it lies the Surovikin line, and of course beyond the Surovikin line, there are more and more defences all the way through Tokmak to Melitopol and to Crimea and to all those other places as well. And we've seen all of the reports, so I'm not going to revisit my various discussions about Ukrainian losses. But it's clear that they have been appalling, and that despite all this enormous, strenuous effort that we've seen over the last 2.5 months, Ukraine has failed to break through anywhere at any point on the front lines, and hope that it will do so is fading. So, given that this is so, it is unsurprising that the Western powers are now clutching around for a plan B, and the plan B, as I've discussed, and as it seems to me Stian Jensen's comments all but confirm, is that there has now been some kind of a shift in support within there's been some kind of a shift within the US government, within NATO, within the Western side, to adopting the position of people like Richard Haass and the Council for Foreign Relations, that some kind of a negotiation with the Russians, some kind of a compromise to extricate the West, the United States, from this ongoing debacle is now essential. But as I have discussed already in this program at great length, there still is this fundamental conceptual inability to accept or understand that the kind of offers that are being made to the Russians, territorial concessions, which one day the West still hopes to take back, just as West Germany eventually was able to gain control of East Germany, that these territorial concessions are nowhere near enough that they are evading the key issue, what for the Russians is the key issue, which is not just Ukraine's NATO membership, but the entire issue since 1991 of NATO's eastward expansion. And can I just say that we see the extent to which NATO's eastward expansion has become a kind of obsession. Most NATO countries, up to fairly recently, have been pretty skeptical about the idea of Ukraine joining NATO. Ukraine disastrously was invited to apply for NATO membership at that catastrophic summit in Bucharest that took place in 2008. The United States was warned by its own ambassador to Moscow, William Burns, that this was an absolutely unacceptable idea for the Russians, that the Russians were adamantly opposed, both for emotional but also for national security reasons, to Ukraine's NATO membership. The US government was told this by William Burns, its ambassador at the time. William Burns, of course, today is speaking a completely different story, but this is what the Russians warned at the time. Nonetheless, the West went ahead. They invited Ukraine to join NATO at a time when a large majority of Ukrainians, according to opinion polls, opposed NATO membership for their country. And they have clung to that position ever since. They simply will not let it go. They have refused any discussion of any solution to the Ukrainian problem that might in some way prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. That, by the way, applies to the February 2015 Minsk Agreement as well. Now, most people, when they talk about the Minsk Agreement, are not, in my opinion, fully aware of its terms. But briefly, the Minsk Agreement doesn't mention Ukraine's NATO membership directly, but it does set out a whole process whereby the internal Ukrainian conflict, and as far as the Russians were concerned, it was an internal Ukrainian conflict, would be resolved. It required Ukraine to grant autonomy to Donbass. It required Ukraine to negotiate with the leaders of the breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, new constitutional provisions, and there were supposed to be elections by the end of 2015 for a new government of national unity to be formed. Now, Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, President Poroshenko, were adamantly opposed to implementation of this agreement. As far as they were concerned, Ukraine needed to remain a unitary state. They were not prepared to concede autonomy to Donbass. They were not prepared to negotiate with the leaders of the Donbass, even though this was all set out in the Minsk Agreement, which President Poroshenko signed. And the reason they were not prepared to do any of these things was because, of course, as far as the Ukrainian government was concerned, doing that would prevent implementation of their plan for a comprehensive Ukrainianization of the entirety of Ukraine, extinguishing all connections to Russia right across Ukraine, which had been the Maidan movement's objective all along. Richard Sakwa, the historian, has written exhaustively about this issue. He has been interviewed by Glenn Deason and myself, and you can find the interview on the Duran, and you can also find an interview which Glenn Deason and I conducted with Nikolai Petrov, another academic, German-based academic, which discusses the same issue as well. But that was the Ukrainian objection, ultimately, to Minsk, to the Minsk Agreement, Minsk II, that it would prevent the Ukraine project that they were committed to from achieving realization. A monolingual, mono-ethnic Ukraine. But of course, NATO and the United States and Britain objected to Minsk also. And their objections to Minsk were, of course, different. And that was, of course, that if Minsk had been implemented, if there'd been a settlement of the Ukrainian conflict along the lines set out in Minsk, if there'd been a new constitution and a government of national unity, then the project of bringing Ukraine into NATO would have been ended once and for all. The leaders of Donbass, the people of Donbass, the Russian-speaking communities in eastern Ukraine, and southern Ukraine, all of whom would have had, in that case, an important say in the formulation of policy in Kiev, as part of that government of national unity, would have been adamantly opposed to Ukraine's NATO membership, Ukraine's constitution, until the Maidan events of 2014 actually stated that Ukraine would be a neutral country. Any new constitution agreed between the parties as part of a settlement of the conflict would have enshrined the same principle of a neutral Ukraine as well. And the result is that the question of Ukraine's NATO membership would have been taken permanently off the agenda. So, the reason why the West colluded in Ukraine's sabotage of the Minsk agreement was because it prevented the project successful implementation of the Minsk agreement would have prevented the project of bringing Ukraine into NATO. Professor Mearsheimer has discussed in many places the extent to which it is this constant issue of NATO, of these constant words spoken to Ukraine about Ukraine joining NATO, which lie at the heart of the problem and which have caused Ukraine to embark upon this disastrous policy, which has brought it to the point in which it is in today. Where I think Professor Mearsheimer is perhaps, let me say, not exactly wrong, but what I think he underestimates is that I sometimes get the impression from what he says that he thinks that the project to bring Ukraine into NATO is not a real one, that NATO officials, US officials don't really believe in it. It's purely a project. It has been purely a project to keep Ukraine and Russia at odds with each other. I disagree. I think that whilst there may be, in fact, undoubtedly there are quite a lot of Western officials and Western governments who do think that, I think the agenda of bringing Ukraine into NATO is a very real one, and I think that has been the objective all along, and I think the Russians have come to realize that, and that is the source of the conflict, and that is the explanation for Western policies. Anyway, there we are. A crisis with this obsession for Ukraine's NATO membership being at its heart. And we see that nothing seems capable of changing this. Ukraine is facing defeat on the battlefield. The offensive is failing. The West understands that it has to seek some sort of compromise with the Russians to end this present conflict, to avoid a debacle, but they still continue to insist with each other, in their talks with each other, that NATO membership, the prospect of NATO membership for Ukraine, is somehow sacrosanct. They can't bring themselves to concede this, even though, as I have said, as William Burns advised the George W. Bush administration all the way back in 2008, it is absolutely something which is totally unacceptable to the Russians. In the meantime, even as the West considers and debates with itself and proposes to the Russians and to the Ukrainians what each of those two will consider unacceptable proposals, Ukraine continues to get smashed. I discussed earlier in the programme how the situation on the front lines points a deeply depressing, increasingly bleak picture for Ukraine. Well, that is far from being the sum total of it, because over the course of the last couple of hours, Russia launched another massive missile attack on Ukraine, and this appears to have involved a multiplicity of different missiles. So somebody has written to me pointing out that when you see the letter KH ahead of a Russian missile designation, as in KH-101, the pronunciation, the correct pronunciation in Russian is H, hard H, as by the way you also find in Greek. I understand that. I think just for simplicity, I'm going to continue to use the expressions KH rather than H. As I said, as a Greek, I understand the point. But briefly, I think Westerners who read about these missiles might have some difficulty understanding what I'm referring to if I, in this one instance, adopt Russian and by the way, Greek pronunciation. So we've had attacks by KH-101 missiles launched from Russian strategic bombers, Tupolev 95s, and apparently a Tupolev 160. We've had more missile strikes. Apparently, Kinjal missiles were also used again. I'm not sure against what targets. There were Uranium-2 drones also used, and there were KH-22 or KH-32 missiles launched from Tupolev 22 M3 bombers as well. These are these huge missiles originally developed by the Soviet Union back in the 1960s, basically for destroying US Navy carriers. And they've remained in service ever since. The Russians have carried out a very deep modernization of this missile. That's the KH-32. I gather it has a new engine, an entirely new electronic suite, but they use the same configuration, the same aerodynamics, and they operate in the same way. Very, very high altitudes, then a almost vertical dive on the target at extremely high velocities, close in fact to hypersonic or perhaps even hypersonic velocities as they fall on the target. And given the combination of the kinetic force of this large missile falling on the target at very high speeds, and of course the explosive power of the very large warhead, the effect of these missiles when they strike a target is absolutely devastating. Now, there's an interesting twist to all of this, because Yuri Ignat, who is either the spokesman of Ukraine's air defense forces or the chief of Ukraine's air defense forces, I'm not sure which it is, but who strikes me, by the way, as being one of the most intelligent and realistic and understanding Ukrainian officers. Anyway, he has now said that Ukraine lacks the capability to destroy these KH-22, or if you prefer, KH-32 missiles that Russia is using. He says that over the entire course of the conflict since February 2022, Ukraine has failed to shoot down a single one of these missiles. Now, that's a very interesting admission. It's an interesting admission in itself because it shows that Ukraine has no counter to these giant missiles that the Russians have. Apparently, even the Patriot missile system has so far failed to shoot these missiles down. Though perhaps, and in fairness, these missiles have been launched at targets which are some distance away from the Patriot missile batteries, which are concentrated in and around Kiev. And that might be the reason for that, but that's not what Ignat said when he said that Ukraine lacks the capability to shoot down these missiles, I got the impression that he meant that it just lacks that capability, that the Patriots can't shoot them down either. Now, if my latter understanding of that is correct, then that rather begs the question of how it is that Ukraine is able, according to its claims and to the claims of Western commentators, to shoot down much more sophisticated, much faster Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. Ukraine claims to have shot down lots of these missiles. I've lost count of how many they claim to have shot down. If they can't shoot down the less sophisticated, slower, much bigger KH-22 or 32, if they're not able to shoot that missile down, how can they shoot down the much more advanced, far more powerful, far more capable KH-47 Kinzhal? And I would add, by the way, that Ukraine has also accepted that it can't shoot down Iskander ballistic missiles. And of course, the Kinzhal missile is apparently a derivative of the Iskander missile. Now, I'm not going to reopen this issue, but I do find it astonishing that so many people have accepted at their word Ukrainian claims to be shooting these Kinzhal missiles down. This is despite the fact that when the first claims that Ukraine was shooting down Kinzhal missiles were being made, that they were successfully shooting down these missiles with the Patriot missile system, people like Ignat, indeed including Ignat himself, went out of their way publicly to deny the fact. Nonetheless, apparently, undoubtedly, Ignat was brought into line. The Ukrainian government insisted that Kinzhal missiles were being shot down, even though Ignat and the Air Defense Command were denying it. And that has now become the unchallengeable orthodoxy, not just in Ukraine, but amongst the Western commentariat also. I'm going to say straight away, I've never believed that. I've never taken those claims seriously. And I think Ignat's admission that Ukraine lacks the ability to shoot down KH-32 missiles is in effect also intended as a quiet admission that it is not shooting down Kinzhal missiles either. He's clearly under orders to pretend that Ukraine is, as a disciplined and loyal officer of Ukraine, he is going along with that fiction. I get the sense he's deeply embarrassed about it, and by admitting that they can't shoot down the earlier, older, less sophisticated KH-22, he's basically telling us that they can't shoot down the Kinzhal either. So I just point what I wanted to make about that, but Ignat also said an awful lot more. He said that with every single missile strike, and this was a big missile strike, the missile attacks from Russia are becoming increasingly sophisticated. He said that the missiles are now constantly changing direction. So he said that when the radar stations report to the Air Defense Command that the missiles are heading towards Kiev, and the air defense commanders in Kiev start preparing their defenses to meet those missiles. Well, even as that is happening, the missiles have changed course. All of the missiles, not just the KH-22s, but the KH-101s, the Calibras, they changed course, and they seem to be heading towards a different target. Then even as they appear to be approaching that target, and the local air defense commanders take further steps to try to counter these missiles, well, again, the missiles change course and eventually strike an entirely different target altogether. And he's already discussed how difficult it is becoming for Ukraine to keep track on the Uranium-2 drones as well, that they're moving in circles, that they engage Ukraine in all kinds of combinations, that they undertake increasingly sophisticated maneuvers, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for Ukraine to keep track of what they're doing. And we're now getting reports, apparently they're coming from Britain, that a factory that Russia has created in the Republic of Tatarstan, which is a part of the Russian Federation, is now coming on stream and is starting to produce Uranium-2 missiles on license from Iran. But these are not the same as the Uranium-2 drones on license from Iran. These are not the same as the Shahed drones that Iran has first designed and licensed to the Russians. They're drones, Uranium-2 drones that the Russians have worked on, and they've changed aspects of their guidance system and their layout and of their structure. They use different materials. And so they're perhaps a rather more potent version of the Uranium-2 drones than the earlier drones that the Russians were launching at Ukraine. The key point, however, and apparently this is, well, it's not apparently, the British Defence Ministry is actually discussing all of this in one of its most recent bulletins. The Russians are able to build hundreds of them. And I've even seen one report that the British Defence Ministry is now warning the Ukrainian government that the Russians might be planning to launch as many as 300 of these drones in drone attacks on Ukraine at any one time. 300 of these drones in one attack, in other words, in order to overwhelm Ukrainian defences. All of this presumably in combination with these missile attacks. It's becoming clear that Ukraine is simply not going to be able to keep up with these constantly evolving and increasingly sophisticated Russian drone and missile strategies. Its own air defense system is now apparently almost run out, the one that inherited from the Soviet Union. There's been this patchwork of Patriots and Iris-Ts and NASAMS missiles and Hawk missiles from the Cold War. All of these systems, Crotale missiles from France, they've all been brought in from the West. It's a patchwork of entirely different missiles. They're not integrated. Apparently they don't integrate easily with each other because they're different types of missiles. And in any event, they're not available in the quantity that the original Ukrainian air defense system had. The missiles are said by some to be less effective than the original S-300 missiles, which were the ones that Ukraine started the war with. And on top of all of that, there are far fewer of them than the air defense missiles that Ukraine started the war with. So a more powerful, more complex, more sophisticated Russian drone and missile offensive against Ukraine, even as Ukraine is struggling to develop an air defense system in response, which is anyway going to be less potent than the one it used to have and which it has lost. So we see how the situation there is deteriorating, and we also see how the Russians are able to hammer any place in Ukraine that they choose to attack. My understanding of the latest Russian drone and missile attack is that once again it attacked, its principal target was Ukraine's remaining military-industrial complex. Whatever factories still continue operating. They've been often attacked in the past. They're being attacked again, and that is what we've just seen. And of course, as the autumn and winter approaches, Ukraine itself is becoming worried that the Russians will resume their offensive against Ukraine's energy system, which is also being held together as a result of a patchwork of repairs, and which this time is in a much worse situation to withstand such an attack as it was last winter. Let me repeat again that the reality is that Ukraine is now running out of time, that the time window is closing, that the Russians have successfully held the Ukrainians back. Ukraine, according to these various reports that we've seen, people like David Sachs, is now running out of reserves. They've committed their last reserves to the offensive. The Russians are advancing in the north, and the Russians are hammering away at Ukraine with this missile and drone offensive, which Ukraine simply cannot withstand, or repel or withstand. So, realism, both on the part of Ukraine and on the part of the West, if a negotiation is to succeed, a negotiation which might spare something of Ukraine, is urgently needed. And I'm afraid that that is not in sight, that the proposals which have been made by NATO, by people like Stian Jensen, undoubtedly acting on behalf of his boss, Jens Stoltenberg, these proposals simply will not fly. There are lots of other things happening as well, and just to briefly touch on some of them. The ruble, after the increase in the interest rates yesterday, has briefly stabilized. The Russian government is now in talks with Russian exporters, for them to use foreign currency to buy rubles. As I've discussed in my program yesterday, the Russian government will do whatever it needs to do in order to stabilize the situation with the ruble. And it may take a little time to happen, but I am confident that it will. And secondly, and more importantly, the African Union has now made it clear that it opposes a military intervention by the ECOWAS states in Niger. Now, given that is so, it is now starting to look to me as if a military intervention by ECOWAS in Niger, from having looked very likely, is starting to look unlikely. Well, this remains a developing story. If ECOWAS does not intervene in Niger, we will have to wait and see what happens next, what the Western states will do, whether they'll start talking to the military leaders in Niger, accepting that they're going to remain there, or whether they're going to try to look for some other means to destabilize that government in Niger. This remains all very uncertain, but at least ECOWAS is now looking less likely to engage in Niger. Well, that's all I'm able to say today over the course of this program. More from me soon. I look forward to joining you all again in future programs. And this is where I end today. Just to repeat again, just to repeat again, you can find all our videos on all our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also you should also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also check out our shop and go to find yourself the various wonderful things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.